If you're going to worry, you might at least do something constructive with it. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the tension surrounding story and data. And I've got an exercise that you can do using the stories around the coronavirus outbreak. This is a very scary time, and maybe there's not a whole lot we can do about the larger picture, but if you pay attention, there's actually quite a lot to be learned here. So 2 days ago, I'm sitting at breakfast, and I'm talking with my 7-year-old son, and I realize that I'm trying to explain to him what Bayesian statistics are. You know, that special time in the life of a young boy when his father pulls him aside. Okay, it's just ridiculous. Now, what I'm trying to do is he's asking me questions about the coronavirus and what it means and what's going on. And I'm trying to explain to him how I see it. But more than that, I'm trying to explain to him how confident I am in what I'm saying and what I believe. Because in the words of David Mamet, like information is imperfect. But in the words of that great David Mamet play, at this point, we don't know. What we have is limited data and unlimited stories. So how do you weight the data? How do you know if the data is right? And then how do you convey that data in imperfect stories and not get seduced, by all the wonderful effects that stories have upon us? And this is a huge distinction. And not just for a 7-year-old, for everybody. I don't think a great number of people probability weight their beliefs. How am I sure that I'm right? And how sure am I that I'm right? These are not flattering questions to ask because they reveal, ignorance, and they reveal how complex the world is and maybe how small we are in comparison to it. But when it comes to stories and it comes to data, you have to ask these questions. Story tells us about what things mean. Data tells us about what we can measure. And if you want to communicate a complex idea, you really need both working in harmony. Because unless you're a very unusual person, I can't just sort of hand you a table of data and have you be convinced of something. It doesn't work that way. When we as communicators do a good job of handling both the story and the data, the result is very powerful. But this balancing act can be tricky. And here's why. We've been telling stories since at least the Stone Age, 2.5 million years. But data, has only been around since 16th century, data as such. Now, I'm just a guy sort of whipping out thoughts here on communication and stories and explaining things and writing and the occasional pandemic. But if I had to pick, I had time to research, I would pick observational astronomy as the first source of data. Specifically this guy, Tycho Brahe. So consider a story like where does lightning come from? Well, what happens when a thunderstorm happens? Well, Zeus is getting angry and throwing lightning bolts. Now, it's not scientifically correct, but it's psychologically perfect. When Dad gets angry, the little ones have to run for cover until the storm passes. It's perfect. However, it doesn't have a lot of explanatory or predictive value. In fact, a physicist might say it doesn't even have the virtue of being able to be wrong, which is you can't falsify it. We can't measure what's going on in Zeus's mind. But if you have a theory of electricity and magnetism and you have some data, now you can start to figure out all kinds of things. You can figure out where would be good to chase tornadoes. You could figure out where to set up a time-lapse camera. You could figure out how to insure people against lightning strikes. You can figure out how to build lightning rods. All kinds of very useful things. And that kind of science is so powerful that we don't often talk about the intersection of story and data. In fact, this is the reason why for the last 250 years, things like rhetoric, persuasion with words, has really sort of been in decline. The idea is that if I hand two policymakers the same census, they're going to agree on what to do. And when you say it out loud, it becomes obvious how not true it is. So there are at least two reasons why I think this is true, and the most important one to my mind is that we can't measure all the things that matter. For the most important information to predict a phenomenon, maybe you can't measure it at all. My favorite example for this is a stock market crash, right? I mean, you can see when the crash happens, but in terms of a predictive model, right? The thing that would be useful to be able to measure would be things going on in investors' heads, right? Sentiment. And we have no measure of what's going on inside somebody's head. So it becomes impossible to predict. So like the latest stock market crash, right? You could say that it was caused by the coronavirus. But you could also say that there are underlying conditions, at the end of a debt cycle, the longest bull market in history, that would also point to it being time for a correction. Why didn't it happen before this? Why didn't it happen in January? Why didn't it happen, sooner? Why didn't it happen the second week of January? And these questions become impossible to answer because we don't have data. So everything that we have that sort of predicts that is kind of a kludge. So let's consider a real-world example. 1854, London. There's a cholera outbreak. And the prevailing theory at the time is that cholera is caused by a vapor, the vapors, swelling up from the ground around the Thames. And this is referred to as the miasmata. I love this theory, not because it's true, but because I love the word miasmata. But there's this physician, Dr. John Snow, not that John Snow, who has a different theory. He's familiar with the germ theory of disease, which is sort of in its infancy, and he's noticed at that point that there is a correspondence between this, where people live, and this drinking well. So if they live around this drinking well, they seem to get cholera. So he thinks, well, there's something in this drinking well that's causing cholera. So he goes to the authorities and he says, I want you to shut down this water pump so people won't get cholera. And they basically laugh at him, which I like to think of as the origin for George R.R. Martin's famous line,
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
So you have to consider how awful this is for Dr. John Snow, because he's pretty sure he's right, and he knows that people are going to die, basically because he can't make a good enough explanation. And that's the kind of thing that would make a man turn to acts of desperation and dark arts. Like data visualization. That's right. He made a map. This map. Which may, in fact, be the first infographic ever. And on the basis of this map and the story he told about it, he got them to shut down the well. They later found out that there was a cesspit draining into the water that was coming out of this well. Now, as a guy who's familiar with the history of plumbing, let me tell you, this is not even remotely close to the stupidest drinking water-related story in history. But that's a digression for another time. So, back to the coronavirus. Now, I'm no expert. Not at all. I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. But what I wanted to do was show you some data and the stories coming out of it and how they relate and kind of what I've noticed about them. So it's said that COVID-19 has a mortality rate of 2 to 3%, and it really only kills people who are above 60 or who have an existing condition, something wrong with their lungs. And it barely affects children at all. Now, from that bit of data, extrapolated from case numbers, we can come up with a number of stories, and people have. Like this, right? My kids will be safe. Or we could say, 2%. I mean, 2% is not a very big number. That's why it's not like an asteroid's hitting the Earth. I don't know why it's such a big deal. Or we could say 2%. There's 8 billion people on the planet. If 2%, that's 160 million people who are going to die. Or, wait, my mom and dad are in their 80s. This is terrible. Or, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump are all well above 60. This means that a candidate for the president of the United States could get the coronavirus, get sick, and die in the middle of an election. Or, I saw the Pope coughing. He's in his 80s. Coronavirus. And on and on and on and on. Now, conjecture is useful, especially for designing experiments, thinking through worst-case scenarios, planning. I mean, it's really very powerful to be able to take some data and extrapolate a great number of stories from it. So here's one of mine. I think the mortality numbers for the coronavirus are being overstated, and here's why. There's not widespread testing for people with the coronavirus, and some people aren't being tested just because maybe it looks like they have the regular flu, maybe their symptoms aren't that severe. So we don't really have a good number of how many people actually have COVID-19 because it's hard to know. But death is a pretty discrete event that anybody can test for. And perhaps someone who has flu-like symptoms who dies, who is then tested, they definitely show up in those numbers. So if the rate is, right, the number of people who died from this divided by the number of people who have it total, if this number gets bigger, the overall rate gets smaller. Now, do I know that for sure? Am I an epidemiologist? No, I don't. But that's a story you can tell with data. So this whole thing becomes a tale told with incomplete data, full of sound and fury, signifying what exactly? Well, at this point, we don't know. For most people, I think this story is going to be true. You ever had the flu? Yeah, well, you're going to get it again. And it's going to suck, but you're going to be okay coming out the other side of it. But wait, what if I have a heart attack or a stroke while the medical system is overwhelmed by COVID-19 patients? You see how that story and data machine just keeps working and working and working? And to be sure, its favorite fuel is fear and negative emotion. But there's lots of positive stories you could come up with. And here's my favorite one, which is, what happens when we come up with a vaccine? Because we do that, and we're going to do that. Did you know we have a vaccine for Ebola? We do. We actually have several vaccines for Ebola. So this is my suggested exercise. Pay attention to every story you hear and every story that pops into your head surrounding the coronavirus, and write them down. Nothing complicated, just 1 to 2 sentences. You can even do this in a spreadsheet, which is going to be handy for the next part, because after you capture the story, I want you to assign it a probability value. What is the probability I think this story is true? In fact, you know what? I'll take the stories I've already written and I'll make them available in a Google Doc, a Google Sheet that you can copy for yourself, and I'll probability rank mine just for fun if you want to do that. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to teach you an amazing amount about how to tell stories with data, how data's influence the stories we tell, the limits of human knowledge, how human beings react, fear, media narratives. I mean, this is in a time where you feel like you can't do very much to make anything positive happen, this is a really great way to learn if you pay a little bit of attention. Welcome to How to Word.